The explosion ripped through the calm waters of Ulithi Atoll with a force that turned dawn into fire. It was November 20th, 1944, when the USS Mississinewa, a Cimarron-class fleet oiler, lay at anchor among a forest of warships that had made the lagoon an unlikely city at sea. She carried nearly 500,000 gallons of fuel, avgas, diesel, and crude, that fed the carrier task forces pushing across the Pacific. At 5:47 a.m., the water under her starboard side detonated. The blast punched a hole in her hull, a thunderclap that threw men from bunks and sent a column of smoke and flame skyward. Within seconds, the tanker was a bonfire. Fuel-fed flames raced across her decks and the surface of the lagoon, turning seawater to a burning, rolling sheet. In the first seconds, there was confusion so total that trained sailors moved as if force had reprogrammed them. Men who had slept through alarms were suddenly upright, clothes in disarray, smelling fuel and hot metal. Those below decks were beaten back by heat and choking smoke. Those who made it topside faced a new horror. The sea the Navy trusted for safety had become an obstacle. Lifelines and rafts were hard to launch. The surface was a patchwork of oil, flames, and desperate heads. Sailors dove, swam, and clawed for anything that could float. Some were pulled through sheets of fire into cooler water beyond the slick. Nearby ships kicked into action, crews throwing lines and ladders, firing hoses, and straining boats into flaming water to drag men clear. For hours, the battle was not with an enemy aircraft or a visible submarine, but with fire itself, a hungry, spreading thing that refused to be bottled. Word traveled across the anchorage. A chiton had struck. At first, the idea seemed absurd. Ulithi was a forward base, yes, but it was crowded with men and ships, and the American command believed the lagoon secure under patrols and screens. Yet the Japanese were pressing unconventional weapons into service. The chiton was one of them, a pilot-guided torpedo with a crude cockpit for a single man, a weapon that turned the torpedo into an instrument of personal sacrifice. Launched from a submerged submarine, the chiton allowed a pilot to steer his explosive charge directly into a ship. Where kamikaze aircraft had terrorized the skies, the chiton tested the water. Mississinewa's deck ruptured, bulkheads collapsed, and quickly she was unsalvageable. Destroyers and tugs maneuvered dangerously close to pour on seawater and hose down decks, while medical teams on other ships readied stretchers and tended to burned men. Crews called names into the smoke, tried to patch holes, and stripped away gear to fashion flotation for survivors. Some who survived the blast were more damaged by the fuel on the water than by the initial explosion. Skin blistered, lungs burned from smoke and chemical fumes, eyes raw from oil and heat. The air reeked of burning clothing, scorching paint, and hot metal. By late morning, the Mississinewa listed and then capsized, sinking into the lagoon and taking dozens with her. Casualty figures finalized later. 63 men were lost, many in the first terrifying minutes when escape routes were cut off by flame. Scores more were wounded, some so badly that recovery would define the rest of their lives. The loss mattered beyond the human toll. A fleet runs on fuel. When a tanker goes dark, the logistical strain multiplies. Mississinewa's destruction became a strategic sting, a vivid demonstration that even supply lines and anchorages were vulnerable. If a forward base like Ulithi could be struck in safety, then the Navy had to rethink how it protected its floating city. For the Japanese, the sinking was hailed in dispatches as a rare success from a program born of necessity. Submarines retrofitted to carry chiton carried pilots who volunteered for one-way missions. Training was austere. The pilot accepted the cockpit as a one-way passage. The launches were brief and grim, punctuated by solemnity and last letters. For the men who trained and launched, it was framed as duty. For those on the receiving end, it felt like a new degree of personal risk, stitched into the mechanics of war. The psychological impact on Allied sailors was immediate. If a tanker could be consumed in its anchorage, no harbor felt entirely safe. Survivors later gave the story its human shape. A signalman would recall a scream, and then the sky lit like daytime. A young fireman would describe how the ship's skin tore as if scored with an axe. A chief petty officer would tell of hauling burned men from slick water and of how, in the shock after, the simplest acts, passing a blanket, counting the living, became everything. Those recollections stitched together a texture that official logs could not capture. Shipmates buried friends at sea, held services on deck that smelled of salt and diesel, and sent home telegrams that translated loss into a handful of formal words. Decades later, divers and historians would return to the Mississinewa's resting place and find a grave that spoke. The hull lay twisted and blackened, plates flaking like scorched skin. Corrosion had taken hold, but the shape of the wound, where the torpedo hit, where the tanks had ruptured, remained visible. Divers found artifacts: a blown-open locker, a life jacket, stamped plates with identification numbers. The wreck's condition became an underwater archive, a place where metal and time recorded a violent morning. For those who study maritime conflict, such wrecks are classrooms. For families, they are private memorials. The wider context sharpened the significance. In late 1944, the Pacific War was taking its most punishing turns. The United States had clawed across islands and seas, building forward bases like Ulithi to project power. Japan, starved of resources and facing mounting losses, turned to asymmetric measures to strike back. The Kaiten program was both tactical improvisation and cultural declaration. It showed an enemy willing to escalate sacrifice when conventional results failed. That willingness imposed a new kind of fear on Allied logistics and forced rapid adaptation. Mississinewa's loss led to practical changes. Patrols intensified, anti-submarine defenses were reinforced, fueling practices and anchor placements were reviewed. The fleet adjusted how it dispersed vulnerable assets and how it guarded the places where ships thought themselves safe. For sailors who served at Ulithi, the memory of that morning became a cautionary reference, proof that danger could arrive where you least expected it. For families and communities ashore, the loss translated to names and faces and empty chairs at tables. For historians, the incident offered lessons in logistics, vulnerability, and how new weapons can reframe theaters of war. There is no neat moral to an event that took lives and altered plans. What remains is a clean record of fact and the messy human residue around it. A ship built to carry life-sustaining fuel consumed in minutes. A pilot in a cockpit who never emerged. Men who fought a fire with hoses and then had to bury friends. A wreck sleeping under coral that still bears the marks of the blast. The calm water of Ulithi Atoll today hides a scar that reminds any visitor that even places called sanctuaries can be pierced by invention and desperation. The dead were counted, the logs closed, and the lessons absorbed. Yet under the waves, the rusting plates still whisper the way war reaches across distance to touch the smallest, most ordinary details of life at sea. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.